The smoke didn't look like weather. It moved like intent, black coiling a fist rising over the east field I planted with my brother's seed map and my own tired hands. I tasted chemicals before I saw flame, the kind that doesn't drift or wander but hunts in straight lines. Training kicked in. 30 years of reading fires the way some folks read faces, origin, wind, fuel, lie. And there she was across the fence, perfect posture, red robe, sunglasses at night, like the rules never applied to her yard or her conscience. People like her don't swing hammers, they swing committees. They don't say burn it, they say beautify the sightline. I didn't shout. I called it in, marked the wind-counted propane yards, and watched the blaze crawl exactly where someone had fed it. If you've ever felt a boundary snap under a stranger's heel, you know this feeling already, not anger, clarity. Tonight you'll hear what fire told me. Before we dive in, drop your city and your local time in the comments. Let me know where you're watching from. The fire had a voice that night. It wasn't the roar of a wildfire rolling across timberland or the hiss of a grass burn on a windy day. This was a crackle laced with spite, each stalk of corn snapping like a bone under heat. I stood there, sweat already dripping down my back, watching flames claw their way into the heart of the east plot, the most fertile ground I had. For a split second I froze. My mind flickered back to the calls I used to answer when I wore turnout gear, the ones where seconds meant houses lives. But this time the life at stake was mine, my family's, and the land my brother left behind. I yanked open the glove box of my truck and pulled out the old radio I never thought I'd use again. My voice was steadier than my hands. This is Samuel Granger. I've got a brush fire east cornfield off Maple Ridge Road bordering Stonebrook HOA. Dry air, heavy fuel load, possible accelerant. Send engines now. The dispatcher didn't question me. Old habits die hard. Once a captain, always a captain. By the time the first siren wailed in the distance, Copper, my hound, was pawing at the gravel drive, whining like he knew we were about to lose more than crops. I grabbed the shovel from the shed and tried to carve a fire, break my boots sinking into the soil that moments ago had been thriving green alive. But the flames leapt like they had a will of their own, rushing toward the irrigation ditch that was my only line of defense. That's when I saw her. Beyond the chain-link fence that marked the line between my farm and the HOA subdivision stood Evelyn Marks, the woman everyone else called Karen, behind her back but never to her face. She didn't look panicked. She didn't look surprised. She looked satisfied. Arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her nose, even though the only light was hellfire. "Did you call 911?" I shouted through the smoke voice raw. She tilted her head slowly, like she was watching a play. "Isn't that your job, farmer boy? After all, it's your mess." Every muscle in me tightened, but I swallowed it. I wasn't going to give her the performance she wanted. I turned back toward the fire, my lungs burning with each breath. The fire engines finally barreled down the drive, red lights cutting through the smoke. Out stepped Chief Alvarez, a man I'd trained myself years ago. His eyes scanned the line of flames, then darted toward the HOA fence line. He didn't need me to say it. The point of origin was obvious. Within minutes, hoses were stretched, nozzles opened, and the field turned into a battlefield. I barked directions without thinking, anchor on the ditch. Protect the barn. Watch for propane tanks by the shed. Old instincts took over and the crew followed without question. It felt like stepping back into the uniform I thought I'd hung up for good. As the flames hissed and died under the weight of water and foam, the truth began to show itself. Near the fence, buried in blackened soil, was a metal canister, charred but not destroyed. I bent down with my gloved hand, lifted it, and felt the heavy weight of gasoline still lingering inside. This wasn't some accident. It was planted. I looked up, and for the first time that night, Evelyn was gone. Her silver SUV sat crooked in her driveway headlights, still faintly glowing as if she'd left in a hurry but hadn't gone far. The grass by her hydrangeas was scorched footprints burned into her lawn. My gut twisted not from fear but from certainty. When Alvarez walked over, I didn't say much, just held up the canister. He raised his brows, muttered a curse, and signaled 2 firefighters to document it. "Looks like arson," he said flatly. "Arson," I repeated, tasting the word like ash. The crew fought the fire for another 20 minutes before it was under control, but the damage was clear. Half my east plot was gone. The field my brother called the Golden Corner was nothing but skeletal stalks and gray soot. I stood there, heart hammering, staring at the destruction, while the rest of the neighborhood lit up with porch lights and murmurs. Neighbors gathered, some pretending they were just out walking dogs, others clutching coffee mugs like props. But none of them came close. They stayed behind the safety of their HOA fences, whispering while I stood in the wreckage. Evelyn's house was dark now, but I could feel her eyes somewhere behind those curtains, watching, calculating. She thought she could light a fire and walk away. She thought fire was just fuel and smoke. But I'd spent a lifetime learning its language. Fire tells the truth. Fire doesn't lie. That night, long after the engines rolled away and the air grew heavy with silence, I walked the fence line again with a flashlight. Every detail mattered. Scorched grass tracing back into her yard. A patch of dirt pressed low like someone had stood there too long. And the canister, oh, I knew what that was. Not farm equipment, not something a neighbor could mistake. A backyard fire pit starter, the kind sold at hardware stores. I bagged the evidence, took photos labeled everything with times, wind direction, and soil condition. Some folks sleep after a blaze. I don't. I've seen too many houses reduced to embers, too many families crying in the glow. I know that justice needs patience, but it also needs proof. As dawn crept over the ridge, the east plot looked like a battlefield after retreat. Black scars stretched across rows where green once swayed. My boots sank in ash, and Copper nosed the ground, whining like he'd lost something he couldn't name. Maybe he had. Maybe we both had. But as I stood there staring at Evelyn's perfect stucco house beyond the fence, one truth burned hotter than the fire itself. She'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The day after the fire, the smell still lingered like a ghost I couldn't chase off. Smoke clung to my clothes, to the porch wood, even to Copper's fur. When I woke, the first thing I heard was silence. No birds, no cicadas, just that hollow quiet that follows destruction. I pulled on my boots, poured black coffee into a thermos, and walked the eastern fence line again. What I saw made my chest tighten. The rows were gone. The east plot, the one my brother always swore caught the best sun, was now nothing but blackened stumps curling inward like fingers clenched in pain. 5 rows were scorched clean through, all stopped by the irrigation trench I dug last spring. That trench had saved the rest of the farm. Without it, the blaze would have swallowed the barn, the tractors, maybe even the house. It was the only thing standing between ruin and survival. I crouched low, flashlight in hand, scanning the scars where green turned to black. That's where truth hides at the edges. And there it was, again, another melted canister, half-buried retail grade, not industrial. And worse, scraps of red nylon fabric edges charred. Evelyn's color. She wore red like armor every HOA meeting, every doorstep confrontation. Coincidence, not a chance. I bagged the evidence carefully, then slipped into the pantry and opened the safe behind the shelves. Inside were my brother's papers, my old fire service badge, and the small thermal camera I'd rigged into the scarecrow we called Sarge. My niece had thought it was funny last fall to dress him in my old fire captain's hat. Turns out that joke might save the farm. The footage wasn't crystal clear, infrared rarely is, but the truth was undeniable. At 2:13 a.m., a figure in a hooded jacket appeared on screen, slipping through a pried section of fence from the HOA side. They carried a bundle under one arm, crouched low, and sparks bloomed. One fire point, then another, then another. For 12 full minutes, the figure adjusted placements, watched flames grow, then strolled back through the gap without a single glance over their shoulder. I rewound, zoomed in, paused frame by frame. The stride was short, sharp, deliberate. Arms tucked close, swinging with that same stiff authority I'd seen Evelyn use when she marched into HOA meetings, barking about community standards like they were commandments. And there on the sleeve, faint but visible in thermal bloom, was the outline of a windbreaker. Red. I printed stills, labeled them, and made 3 backup copies. A man doesn't survive decades of fire calls without learning redundancy. Then I called Thomas Heller, my lawyer. He was a retired JAG officer, the kind of man who didn't waste words. I laid it out. The fire, the evidence, the footage. He didn't interrupt. When I finished, he said, "Only, you have backups." "Yes." "Good. Then we move carefully. Don't confront her. Don't knock on her door. Let me handle the fire marshal. Give me 24 hours. 24 hours later, Fire Marshal Clay Polk pulled into my drive. He was a straight shooter, served on the department back when I still wore the uniform. We shook hands without a word, and I handed him the evidence bags. He studied the footage, his jaw tightening. "If this holds, it's criminal arson," he said. "Not just property damage. Felony." He walked the fence with 2 inspectors shining UV lights across the grass. The accelerant trail started on Evelyn's side and bled under the fence line. He knelt, scraped soil into a vial, then muttered, "She's in trouble." That night at 3:15 a.m., they knocked on her door. I stood 50 yards away, arms folded, watching. Evelyn opened in a crimson robe, mascara streaked like she'd been crying or wanted to look like she had. When Polk showed his badge, she gestured wildly at me at the field, her voice sharp and frantic. But when they held up the melted canister, she slipped. "That's not mine," she blurted. "I threw it out last week." Her mistake echoed down the quiet street. Neighbors' porch lights snapped on. Phones recorded from across lawns. For the first time, she looked rattled. The next morning, whispers spread faster than any fire. Some neighbors avoided eye contact as they walked their dogs. Others lingered, pretending to water plants while staring at my gate. Rick, the HOA treasurer, shuffled over pale. "I didn't know she'd go that far," he said. His voice cracked. I didn't thank him. I just said, "Be ready to testify." By noon, I was meeting with Thomas again. He already had civil paperwork drafted, damages, harassment, trespassing, attempted zoning fraud. "She'll lawyer up," he warned. "Claim emotional distress. Spin it as your fault." I nodded. She lit the match. "I'll light the truth." That afternoon, a patrol car parked across from Evelyn's driveway. No cuffs yet, but the message was clear. The HOA board had overreached, and now the law was circling. Dana, the social chair, wouldn't meet my eyes. Rick's face looked like he hadn't slept. The neighborhood was cracking, just like the East Field, but where the soil could regrow, Evelyn's grip never would. And as I stood by the irrigation ditch, copper at my heel, the ash swirling at my boots, one thought burned brighter than all the rest. This wasn't just a feud anymore. It was war. And I wasn't the one who started it. But I was damn sure going to finish it. When you live on the edge of two worlds, the tidy cul-de-sacs with their identical mailboxes and the rough, honest churn of a working field, you learn to read gestures as warnings. A whisper becomes a campaign when it's repeated enough. It starts small, a letter slipped through the gate about equipment, visibility, a notice about odor nuisance, a polite request that slowly hardens into an ultimatum. For months, that's how it played out. The HOA's missives arrived in my mailbox with the same neat blue ink and the same clipped signature, Evelyn Marks. At first I thought it was Garden Club, fussing the sort of petty paperwork people use to fill their evenings. But the letters multiplied. Each one added a formal veneer to the pressure-layering bureaucracy over malice until it became choking. They complained about tractor noise during harvesting hours of the unsightly rows that interrupted the view of their carefully landscaped yards. Someone filed a complaint about a chicken, one old hen, that wandered too close to the sidewalk, and the note read like an indictment. I answered with facts. My land was zoned agricultural long before Stonebrook existed. My tractors were within legal noise times. My compost complied with county regs. The replies kept coming, not from a neighbor with a question, but from a board that smelled a problem and decided the problem was me. Evelyn had a knack for dressing harassment up as civic duty. She'd come to my gate once with a smile and a stack of pamphlets talking about community standards and beautification initiatives. The way she said we was like a gauntlet thrown. We'd like to see a softer edge facing the subdivision, she told me. Maybe some hedges, some wildflowers. Her smile was the practiced kind that belongs to someone who knows exactly how to fit into every room. I told her once calmly that this wasn't ornamental turf. It fed people. That was the moment I saw the flicker in her face, the flash of something like hunger for control. She left with a promise to look into options. That promise translated into last-ditch letters, consultants, and eventually an attempt to build a paper trail that painted my farm as a danger. It's tricky to prove a campaign of small cruelties. Each letter, each anonymous post on a neighborhood forum, each concern raised at a board meeting looked reasonable by itself. But reasonable piled on. Reasonable becomes ruin. They commissioned a visual impact assessment paid from HOA funds. The consultant's invoice was neatly routed through a cousin of one of their board members, an odd coincidence that coyly I couldn't ignore. They ordered soil samples and inspectors, who wrote reports with the same vague, alarmist language: potential environmental risk, outdated agricultural practices, community safety. These weren't meant to discover truth. They were meant to manufacture justification. The quieter, meaner tactics were worse. Mailboxes painted garish pink with the word scab written across mine. Trash flung into my irrigation ditch. Teenagers who used to buy eggs from my farm stopped coming around because someone had started a whisper campaign about health risks. The cumulative weight of those small things presses on you. You either fold or you fight back. I'm not the folding type. My brother taught me better than that. I started keeping records. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd learned the world didn't award justice to the loudest squeal, it rewarded receipts. Every letter, every oddly timed visit from a county inspector, every phone call that ended with someone hanging up when they heard my name went into a folder. I wrote down dates, times, who said what. When the mailbox was vandalized, I took photos and filed a police report. When someone dumped grass clippings into the ditch, I documented the clog, the smell, the timestamp of the service truck on that route. The pattern emerged slowly, the way a map appears if you shade in enough lines. The HOA leveraged its own rules like a club to beat neighbors into compliance. They sent notices that read, like legal warnings, violation of bylaws, nuisance citations, implied threats of fines. They lacked jurisdiction over my property, true, but the pressure was indirect and corrosive. Paint the farmer as a problem, make lenders and buyers nervous, push him to sell or alter his operation. That's how power operates in suburban camouflage paperwork and posture 1,000 polite pushes, disguised as community concern. And then came the anonymous article on the community bulletin, a blurry photo of my barn and paragraphs about outdated practices and fire hazards. Someone went out of their way to circulate fear. I had neighbors whispering as they passed my gate, their eyes sliding away like they'd just been told a secret they couldn't repeat. The loneliness that brings is heavy. It's the kind of isolation that makes you second-guess everything. But it also teaches you to rely on evidence more than applause. That was when I rigged Sarge. My niece laughed at the idea of a scarecrow with a camera in its chest, calling it a rural James Bond prop, but it wasn't a joke. I'd already had small incidents: trash in the ditch, a missing bag of feed, but nobody stepped in to stop the slow erosion. If someone was going to escalate, I wanted to be ready. The camera was thermal hidden, battery-backed, and redundant. I consulted my old colleagues about chain of custody for footage, small steps, a retired guy with a history of fire investigations knows to take before evidence is worth anything in court. When Sarge recorded the night figure, and the pattern of sparks and movement matched the complaints, and the ground evidence, the pieces stopped being circumstantial. That was the point where private harassment became criminal enterprise. It's one thing to complain about appearance or to push for landscaping. It's another to tamper with fences, to plant accelerants, to orchestrate a campaign meant to remove not only a person's crops, but their standing in the community. People who hide behind rules are often the ones who write them for others and exempt themselves. That's the rot I saw in the HOA's playbook. They used committees and for the good of the community rhetoric to hide a hunger for control. The fire was the first violent act in a campaign that had been burning quietly for months. The footage gave us a face to point to, a timeline to follow, and a motive to explain. It didn't erase the long weeks of whisper campaigns, but it turned those whispers into something that could be answered in a courtroom. When I handed the printed stills to Thomas and then to Marshall Polk, I felt the weight of months shift. For the first time since the letters began, the noise outside my gate felt less like a threat and more like evidence. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about accountability. They wanted my field gone. They found the wrong man to make invisible. I kept filing copies, labeling every note, every invoice, every strange consultant's bill. Because when people choose to weaponize, civility paper can become the slingshot that brings them down. It's funny how war doesn't always begin with a bang. Sometimes it creeps in like mildew, darkening corners until the whole wall caves. By the time I realized what Evelyn and her board were doing, it was already too late to call it neighborly nuisance. It had become siege warfare, just quieter, masked in stationery and bylaws. The small acts told the story better than any grand confrontation. One morning I stepped out to fetch the paper and found my mailbox dripping with neon pink paint, the word scab smeared across the side like a wound. Another evening, my irrigation ditch lifeline of the East Field was clogged with soggy trash bags stuffed with grass clippings and kitchen waste. Not random dumping. This was deliberate, aimed right at the intake point where it would choke water flow. And every time the same pattern: no witnesses, no cameras catching faces, just the aftermath. That's when I stopped pretending it was coincidence. I set up motion sensors around the shed, and most importantly in Sarge. From a distance, he was just a scarecrow slumped at the field's edge, wearing my old fire captain's hat, patched jeans, and a plaid shirt. But in his chest, I'd tucked a thermal-triggered camera wide-angle lens night vision. I'd built it more out of instinct than certainty, a reflex honed from years of documenting fire origins. The law doesn't care much for suspicion, it cares for proof. Proof came one restless night. Copper stirred first, growling low in his chest. I woke to the faint crackle of static from the sensor alarm. By the time I reached the porch, a faint orange flicker was already rising beyond the rows. I sprinted toward Sarge's perch, knowing the camera was rolling, capturing what I might not be able to see. The footage the next morning was enough to stop my breath. The thermal image showed a figure slipping through a loosened section of fence precisely where the metal posts had been pried just wide enough. They carried a bundle tucked under one arm, knelt, and sparks flared. Not once, not twice, but in deliberate sequence, like setting kindling for a campfire. They stayed 12 minutes, long enough to adjust placement, long enough to ensure the blaze would spread. Then they walked back through the gap without looking over their shoulder. The stride, the tilt of the head. It was her, Evelyn, Even in infrared, her stiff, short steps were unmistakable. And then the detail that sealed it, the sleeve of a jacket, faint heat, reflecting off synthetic fabric, a telltale strip of color red. She wore that same windbreaker every time she marched to an HOA meeting to scold me for overwatering. I didn't rush to her door, didn't shout across the fence. I'd learned long ago that emotion burns hotter than logic and leaves you with ashes. Instead, I downloaded the footage, backed it up in triplicate and printed stills with timestamps. Chain of custody admissibility, no gaps. This wasn't a neighborhood spat anymore, it was evidence in a felony. When I met Thomas, the lawyer, in his office, I slid the stills across his desk. He didn't blink, just leaned back and asked if I had duplicates stored off-site. I nodded. Good, he said. Because she'll claim you tampered. People like her always do. His plan was simple, no confrontation, no threats. Let the fire marshal handle the criminal side, while we built a civil case that tied her harassment campaign to the HOA itself. 24 hours later, Marshal Polk arrived at my farm. He wore the same serious expression I remembered from the department days. Together we walked the fence. He crouched where the accelerant trail shimmered faintly under UV light. He scraped soil into vials, bagged the melted canisters, noted the trampled grass. Not looking good for her, he murmured. That night they knocked on Evelyn's door. I stood in the dark 50 yards off, arms crossed. She answered in her crimson robe, mascara smeared like she'd rehearsed grief. Polk held up the evidence bag. She blurted too quickly. That's not mine. I threw it away last week. And just like that, the slip of tongue became a noose. Porch lights flicked on across the subdivision. Phones lifted. Neighbors filmed the HOA queen caught fumbling. By morning, whispers buzzed louder than cicadas in July. Some neighbors avoided my eyes as they jogged past. Others lingered with dogs on leashes too short, pretending not to stare. And then Rick, the treasurer, who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, approached the fence. His face was pale. I didn't know she'd go that far, he said. His voice cracked. I didn't thank him. I didn't offer comfort. I just said, be ready to testify. That same afternoon, Thomas called with the next step. We're filing civil damages, harassment, trespass, zoning interference. She'll fight dirty claim, emotional distress, spin it as your fault. I looked out over the blackened east field, the skeletal stalks clawing at the sky. She lit the match, I said, voice flat. I'll light the truth. The patrol car parked outside her house the next day wasn't just law enforcement, it was a signal. The HOA's fortress of bylaws was cracking. Dana, the social chair who used to beam false smiles, kept her head down when she saw me. Neighbors whispered in pairs, avoiding eye contact. The board had turned a blind eye to Evelyn's crusade, but now the fire had forced their silence into daylight. I stood by the irrigation ditch, copper pressed against my leg ash, curling around my boots. I felt it then, not fear, not even rage, but clarity. She had escalated from letters and gossip to gasoline and flame. And while she thought the fire would erase my livelihood, she hadn't accounted for the one thing she couldn't control: evidence. This wasn't just a feud anymore. This was war, and I knew how to fight it. Not with fists or fire, but with patience, proof, and the kind of steady resolve that breaks stronger enemies than a homeowner's board. The investigation turned the neighborhood into a stage, and every house became an audience. People who once ignored me now lingered at their porches, watching law enforcement cars idle near Evelyn's driveway. The patrolmen weren't there to arrest her yet, just to ensure evidence was preserved and questions asked. But in a subdivision where gossip traveled faster than rainfall, their presence was louder than sirens. Marshal Polk didn't waste time. He and his team marked off the east fence line with tape crouching to collect soil samples and ash residues. Under a UV flashlight, the accelerant shimmered faintly across grass blades, a neon trail pointing directly toward Evelyn's hydrangeas. Origin's clear one, Inspector muttered. She started it on her side, carried it across. Polk nodded, but said nothing. He didn't need to. The silence carried its own conviction. By the second day, neighbors whispered openly. Dana, the social committee chair who never met a sentence she couldn't lace with a fake smile, avoided me entirely. Rick, the treasurer, looked like he'd aged 10 years overnight. And then, in a twist I almost admired, Evelyn tried to flip the script. She hosted an informal gathering at her yard, claiming she was the victim of harassment. A handful of board loyalists attended, but most stood awkwardly sipping lemonade, their eyes darting toward the blackened field like they couldn't pretend anymore. I stayed on my porch, arms crossed, watching. Copper barked once and settled at my feet. I didn't need to disrupt her theater. The truth was already smoldering beneath her stage. Later that week, Thomas, my lawyer, called me into his office. His desk was covered in files, each one labeled with neat handwriting. She's going to counterclaim, he said. Emotional distress, invasion of privacy, maybe even defamation. But we have something stronger: pattern and motive. The letters, the vandalism, the consultants paid with HOA funds. It shows escalation, not accident. He handed me a folder. Inside were copies of invoices, soil tests, landscaping, consultants, all tied to Evelyn's relatives or personal accounts. Misuse of HOA funds. I whistled low. So, it wasn't just fire she played with. Exactly, Thomas said. We're not just defending your land, we're building a case that this was systemic abuse of power. The weight of it settled on me. This wasn't just Evelyn anymore. It was the HOA itself, a machine she'd fueled with control and fear, and if we toppled her, the machine would fall with her. That evening, Polk stopped by again. He carried a small evidence bag, inside of which lay a modified ignition trigger wrapped in duct tape. We found 3 of these buried in your field, he said. Cheap timers, butane cartridges. Not professional work, but calculated. His voice dropped. This wasn't rage, it was planned. Hearing it put a stone in my chest. Rage you can dismiss as heat of the moment, stupidity. Planning means intent. Malice. She hadn't just wanted to scare me, she wanted to erase me. The neighborhood couldn't hide from it anymore. A video clip leaked 15 seconds of the thermal footage from Sarge. Grainy infrared, but unmistakable. A figure crouching at the fence, sparks flaring, red sleeve catching light. It spread across the Stonebrook HOA forum before moderators tried to delete it. But by then, screenshots had already traveled through group chats and emails. The mask was off. The next day, a local reporter showed up at my gate. She asked if I wanted to comment on the fire feud between farmer and HOA board. I shook my head. No feud, I said. Just evidence. Then I turned away. Let them print what they wanted. I had the truth on tape. Inside the subdivision, the board scrambled. An emergency meeting was called in the clubhouse. I wasn't invited, of course, but I didn't need to be. Word travels. Bernard, the HOA president, tried to calm residents, insisting the board cannot prejudge guilt. But Rick, pale and trembling, raised his hand and asked the question everyone feared. Are we liable? Silence followed. Liability meant money. Money meant lawsuits. Suddenly, Evelyn's crusade didn't look like community service. It looked like a noose tightening around their wallets. For the first time in months, I felt the shift. Their fortress of forms and fines had cracks. People stopped avoiding my gate. One older neighbor, Mr. Haskins, even brought over a pie, muttering, I never liked the way she ran things. Others weren't brave enough for gifts, but offered nods, half smiles, the kind of silent apologies you see in people who realize they chose the wrong side. Meanwhile, Evelyn doubled down. She walked the cul-de-sacs in her red windbreaker, knocking on doors, spinning tales about how I'd fabricated evidence, how I'd installed spy cameras to intimidate her. But paranoia smells different from leadership. The more she insisted, the more isolated she looked. Her Lexus sat untouched in her driveway, weeds creeping along the edges of her immaculate lawn. The queen was cornered in her own castle. Still, I knew better than to celebrate early. Cases like this aren't won by gossip or sympathy. They're won in court with receipts and patience. Thomas reminded me every day, she'll fight dirty. Don't let her bait you. So I kept walking the charred rows each morning, cataloging damage, rechecking the irrigation line, making notes, not just for my own sanity, but for the record. Because this wasn't just a story about a burned field, it was a story about control abuse and what happens when someone decides the rules don't apply to them. One evening, as the sun dipped low, I stood at the ditch line with Copper at my side. Across the fence, Evelyn's blinds shifted just enough to catch the glint of her eye. We stared at each other through smoke-stained air. She thought she'd broken me, but all she'd done was hand me the match to light her empire's collapse. The HOA always wore politeness like armor. Letters stamped with neat headers, meetings full of perfumed smiles, minutes recorded in fonts too clean to betray the venom behind them. But when the fire scorched my east field, and the evidence pointed straight back to Evelyn, that armor began to crack. You could hear it in the way neighbors whispered on sidewalks, see it in the way Rick's hands trembled when he carried folders from the clubhouse. It didn't take long before one of them broke ranks. Rick showed up at my gate on a muggy afternoon, shifting nervously like a kid caught sneaking cigarettes. He cleared his throat, glanced over his shoulder, then said, She pushed us. All of us. We signed things we shouldn't have. I leaned against the post, arms crossed, letting him sweat. He continued, The board minutes, there's a record. 2 weeks before the fire, Evelyn said, and I quote, If zoning won't stop him, maybe fire hazards will. We thought she was exaggerating, trying to scare us into pressuring you. None of us imagined she meant. His voice trailed off. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just about Evelyn's obsession. It was about the HOA itself, complicit, enabling hiding behind procedures while she lit matches. Thomas nearly grinned when I handed him Rick's confession. "Perfect," he said. "This ties the harassment directly to official board actions. No more claiming she acted alone. We're filing against both Evelyn and the HOA." The filing shook Stonebrook harder than the flames. Civil damages, illegal harassment zoning, interference. The words carried weight heavier than any rumor. Bernard, the HOA president, called an emergency closed meeting, but neighbors leaked details before the night was over. They feared liability, feared losing more than hedges and property values. Their fortress of bylaws had become a paper trail straight to court. Meanwhile, Polk's criminal investigation dug deeper. Inspectors uncovered 2 more modified ignition devices buried near my ditch timers, rigged with cheap butane cartridges. Not professional, but deliberate. Intent, Polk said flatly, handing me the report. She wanted it to spread while she slept, then claim ignorance. When the news leaked, because it always does, the neighborhood forum erupted. Posts vanished as quickly as they appeared, moderators scrambling, but screenshots survived. A blurry still from my Scarecrow camera circulated. Evelyn crouched at the fence, Sparks' blooming sleeve glowing faintly red. People argued about resolution, but no one could deny the outline. It was her. The HOA's self-appointed guardian of appearances, caught lighting the ugliest scene of all. Evelyn tried to fight back. She issued a statement through her lawyer claiming she'd been targeted, that I was spying on her with illegal cameras, that the footage was doctored. But fear smells different than confidence, and her words carried the sour tang of desperation. The local paper picked up the story. Cornfield Blaze Sparks HOA scandal board member under investigation. They interviewed neighbors, quoting one who muttered, "She always hated that farm. Said it ruined the view." Another admitted, "We thought she was just pushy. We didn't think she'd..." The sentence ended in silence. I didn't give interviews. When a news van parked outside my gate, I waved them off. No comment. The evidence speaks for itself. Let them film the charred field. It told the story better than I could. But I didn't sit idle. Each day I added to the file photos, invoices, letters, notes. Thomas called it a war chest. To me it was survival. Paper against fire. Receipts against lies. The HOA board started fracturing. Dana, the social chair, posted a resignation on the community bulletin board full of vague apologies about lessons learned and commitment to healing. No one believed it. Bernard clung to his role, insisting the board acted in good faith. But Rick's quiet testimony and the leaked minutes proved otherwise. They hadn't just tolerated Evelyn, they'd funded her vendetta with HOA money. Neighbors began approaching me not with threats or complaints, but with guilt. An older couple, the Simmons, stopped at my gate, voices trembling as they admitted they'd voted for Evelyn's proposals out of fear of being fined themselves. "We should have spoken up," Elaine whispered. I nodded, not forgiving, not condemning, just recording. At night I sat on the porch with Copper curled at my feet, staring at the field's black scars. The air smelled faintly of gasoline, still stubborn even after the rain. I thought about my brother, about the promise I'd made to keep the land whole. Evelyn thought she could erase history with fire, but she didn't understand this soil remembered. The civil suit gained momentum. Depositions loomed. Reporters circled, and Evelyn. She stopped walking the cul-de-sacs in her red windbreaker. Her blinds stayed closed. Her once manicured lawn grew ragged at the edges, weeds curling like laughter at the irony. The queen of appearances undone by neglect of her own. But the most telling moment came one evening when a sheriff's deputy knocked at her door. I watched from across the fence as she answered, face pale, robe clutched too tight. The deputy handed her a formal notice request to seize her electronics. Probable cause established. Evidence demanded. She argued at the doorstep, gesturing wildly, but the deputy remained stone-faced. Finally, she slammed the door. The blinds trembled. That was when it hit me: the fire she lit had leapt its boundaries. It wasn't confined to my field anymore. It was crawling through the HOA, into her house, into the reputation she'd built like a fortress. And unlike flames on corn, this blaze wouldn't be put out with water. I exhaled slowly, the night air cool in my lungs. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time I knew the tide had turned. Courtrooms don't smell like justice. They smell like stale coffee, polished oak, and the faint sweat of nerves. When I walked through those heavy glass doors, I wasn't just a farmer defending scorched rows of corn. I was dragging an entire HOA into the light, with Evelyn at the center, red blazer buttoned tight, as if fabric alone could hold her crumbling empire together. The civil case came first. Damages, defamation, harassment, property destruction. Thomas laid it out with the calm precision of a surgeon. He started not with the fire, but with the years of harassment letters, fake inspections, HOA funds spent on consultants tied to Evelyn's family. He called it systematic abuse of power. I watched the judge's eyes narrow when he read the board minutes aloud, the very words Rick had leaked. If zoning won't stop him, perhaps fire hazards will. Evelyn's lawyer, a slick-haired man from the city, stood and tried to turn the story upside down. Your Honor, he began, this is a dispute between neighbors inflated by personal vendettas. My client has served the community with distinction. The plaintiff, however, has resisted every attempt at cooperation, turning minor disagreements into conspiracy. His voice dripped with rehearsed confidence, but I saw his hands twitch when Thomas displayed the infrared still. Evelyn's silhouette crouched at the fence sleeve, glowing red. Then Rick took the stand. He shifted nervously, but spoke clearly. She pushed us. She told the board if we kept pressing, he'd either sell or snap. She said the cornfield cheapened the property line. We didn't think she meant fire. The judge leaned forward, expression unreadable, but the silence in the room told me enough. When it was my turn, I swore in, laid my hand on the Bible, and faced both the judge and Evelyn. My voice didn't shake. I walked them through the timeline, through the scarecrow footage, through the canisters bagged in evidence. I explained the way accelerants burn, how flame patterns reveal truth. I'd taught recruits this language once. Now I was translating it for a courtroom. Fire doesn't lie, I told them. And the fire in my east field had spelled one name. Evelyn's lawyer tried to rattle me. Isn't it true you installed cameras to intimidate her? That you have a history of confrontation with the HOA? I leaned forward steady. I installed cameras because someone kept vandalizing my property. And the only confrontation I've had is keeping my land legal and my brother's promise alive. He pressed again, but the judge overruled. After hours of testimony, Thomas closed with the weight of everything we'd presented. Your Honor, my client planted corn. That was his crime. For that, his livelihood was nearly erased by flames lit in the dead of night. This isn't about neighborly squabbles. This is about accountability. The board acted beyond its authority, and one of its members took that crusade to fire and gasoline. The judge recessed, leaving the room heavy with held breath. Evelyn sat stiff, pearl necklace gleaming, but her eyes flickered to me once, just once, and I saw fear. Not anger. Fear. When the gavel finally fell, the decision came sharp. The court ruled in my favor. Evelyn and the HOA were ordered to pay damages 6 figures that wouldn't bring back my brother's rose, but would remind them justice had a price. The HOA was further ordered to cease and desist any enforcement actions against my property. The words rang hollow in the quiet, but to me they sounded like air after smoke. But it didn't end there. Outside, reporters swarmed. Microphones shoved in my face, questions flying. Do you think the HOA was complicit? How will you rebuild? I answered only once. This land remembers, and so do I. Then I walked past them, copper at my heel, ignoring the flashes. Days later, the criminal case escalated. The DA filed charges: felony arson, malicious destruction, trespassing, misuse of HOA funds. Evelyn's lawyer shouted fabricated evidence, but the thermal footage, the soil samples, the ignition devices together, they painted a picture no denial could blur. Meanwhile, the HOA fractured like rotten wood. Dana resigned, citing personal reasons. Bernard clung to the presidency but lost his footing as homeowners demanded accountability. Meetings turned into shouting matches, neighbors who once cowered now, demanding refunds for unjust fines and answers for their misplaced trust. The fallout spread further. Local news aired the footage in grainy loops voiceovers, framing Evelyn as the symbol of HOA abuse. National outlets picked up the story: suburban HOA scandal, cornfield fire exposes abuse of power. People across the state debated it, some siding with property values, others with property rights. Through it all, I stayed quiet. My job wasn't to win public opinion, it was to protect the soil under my boots. Each morning I walked the blackened field boots, crunching on ash, notebook in hand. Some rows were dead, but other survivors still pushed green tips toward the sky. Life doesn't wait for lawsuits. Then came the evening that sealed it for me. I stood by the irrigation ditch, copper at my side, when I noticed movement across the fence. Evelyn, once queen of the subdivision, now stood alone on her porch. Her robe sagged, her hair unkempt. She looked across at me, not with fire, not with smugness, but with a hollow stare of someone who realized the empire she built from bylaws and gossip was burning faster than my corn ever had. For the first time, I didn't feel anger, just a strange calm. The fire she lit had leapt beyond her control, and the blaze of truth wasn't mine to extinguish, it was hers to endure. You'd think victory would taste sweet, but in truth it was more like ash cooling on the tongue. The court had ruled in my favor. The HOA had been ordered to cease their harassment, and Evelyn now faced criminal charges that could bury her for years. Yet as I walked the charred rows of my east field, there was no cheering crowd, no confetti, just silence. The kind that follows fire when all that's left is scorched earth and the long patient work of regrowth. The fallout in Stonebrook was immediate and brutal. The HOA board, once a wall of polite smiles and sharpened bylaws, collapsed under its own weight. Dana's resignation was only the first stone to fall. Within weeks, 2 more board members quit, citing family obligations. What they really meant was they couldn't stand the glare of neighbors whispering words like complicit and fraud. Bernard, the president, who had once thundered about protecting property values, found himself cornered at every meeting. Residents shouted over him, demanding refunds for fines that had been levied without cause receipts, for consultants who turned out to be Evelyn's cousins, and explanations for why HOA dues had quietly risen while sidewalks crumbled. It became clear the board hadn't just been negligent, they'd been rotten. An anonymous thumb drive arrived one morning in my mailbox, no return address. Inside were hundreds of emails from HOA archives. Evelyn mocking neighbors for trashy yard decor, Dana joking about fines as easy revenue, Bernard urging the board to keep pressure on the farmer until he breaks. The words dripped with contempt, exposing them not as guardians of community but as bullies armed with letterhead. I handed the drive straight to Thomas. He smiled grimly. This isn't just civil anymore. This is federal misuse of funds, maybe wire fraud. I realized then that the fire Evelyn lit was only the most visible flame. Beneath it smoldered years of corruption, a network of quiet abuses finally dragged into daylight. Neighbors changed too. The same folks who once crossed the street to avoid me now walked up my drive with apologies and offerings. Elaine Simmons brought a basket of apples, her voice quivering as she said, "We should have stood up sooner." Julio, a quiet man I'd only nodded to in passing, dropped off fresh eggs with a note, "We stand with the soil." Even teenagers who had once laughed at my scarecrow came by, awkward but sincere, asking if they could help replant. The east field, though scarred, showed signs of resilience. Tiny shoots poked through blackened soil where irrigation had softened the burn. Life insists on coming back, even when people try to smother it. I tilled carefully, preparing for winter cover crops to hold the ground together until spring. Each seed I planted felt less like farming and more like testimony, proof that this land was bigger than Evelyn's vendetta. Evelyn herself became a ghost. Her once immaculate lawn grew patchy weeds curling at the edges. Her Lexus sat idle in the drive, collecting dust. Rumor spread she'd put the house up for sale, but no sign appeared, just silence blinds drawn tight. The woman who had strutted through cul-de-sacs with clipboards and threats now hid behind curtains, waiting for lawyers' calls and the slow grind of justice. One morning, Rick appeared at my fence again. His shoulders were straighter this time, though his eyes carried the weight of regret. "We're restructuring," he said. Residents voted. No more unchecked board power. Finances will be audited, term limits enforced. We'll never let this happen again. I studied him for a long moment, then nodded. About time. He swallowed hard, then added, "And I'm sorry." The words were simple, but they mattered. Weeks later, Evelyn's trial began. I didn't attend every session Thomas handled most, but when I did step into the courtroom, I saw a woman transformed. Gone was the queen in her red blazer. In her place sat a figure, hunched in gray hair, limp eyes hollow. The charges were heavy: felony arson, destruction of property, trespassing, fraud. Witnesses lined up, from firefighters who battled the blaze to neighbors who had heard her threats in meetings. And when the scarecrow footage played on the big screen, the room went still. The grainy image of her crouching with sparks in hand was more damning than any testimony. Her lawyer spun excuses: stress, paranoia, provocation, but the jury wasn't buying. They saw what I had seen: intent. The verdict came guilty on multiple counts. The sentence wasn't the maximum 18 months in a state facility followed by probation, but it was enough. Enough to end her reign, enough to mark her name not as HOA chairwoman, but as a cautionary tale whispered in cul-de-sacs. When I returned to my porch that night, copper at my feet, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Not silence enforced by threats, but real peace. The kind that grows after fire, when the air clears and the soil begins to breathe again. What Evelyn tried to destroy with fire ended up burning her own empire. It reminded me that power built on fear and control always collapses when truth finally catches flame. Justice doesn't always arrive with applause. It comes in slow, steady steps, evidence gathered, patience tested, and courage to stand firm when it feels like the world is against you. For anyone listening, protect what's yours. not just land or property, but your dignity, your right to live without being bullied into silence. And when someone lights a match against you, don't answer with fire. Answer with proof, patience, and persistence. If you've ever faced an HOA nightmare or someone who thought their rules were bigger than your rights, share your story in the comments. And if you believe more people should hear how these battles unfold, subscribe to the channel because the fight for truth, big or small, is one we all share.